Professor Katie Allen is a paediatric gastroenterologist and allergist with a particular interest in food allergy, and she has really conducted some pioneering research in this area. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her to deliver this keynote address. So she's a practicing gastroenterologist and allergist at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, but has a number of additional roles as well. She's the Director of Population Health Research at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and Director of the Australian Centre for Food and Allergy Research, and also heads a large cohort study investigating the determinants and outcomes of food allergy in children. This is called the Health Nuts Study. So Katie's really an outstanding researcher. It's fantastic that she's been able to come to deliver this keynote, and I welcome her to deliver that now. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for that generous introduction, and to the organisers for inviting me along to talk about what, quite frankly, people ask me about in the general community constantly. If I'm at a dinner party or watching my kids play hockey, if anyone starts to ask me what I'm doing, I sort of say, oh, look, I'm working in the area of food allergy research, and they go, is food allergy on the rise? And I go, well, and I try to give them a bit of a sort of technical response. They're not really interested in hearing what I have to say. They all know it's on the rise. And then they say, but why? Why is it on the rise? And again, before I can get my long-winded academic answer out, they tell me why they think it's on the rise. So at the end of this, if you'd like to come and tell me why you think it's on the rise, I am keeping a bit of a book about this. But this is my long-winded 1 hour answer to why I think food allergy is on the rise. And quite frankly, no one at the hockey field can be bothered listening to this. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to what I have to say. I do tend to gallop through slides pretty quickly, so put your hands up if I'm going too fast. But it's a very, very interesting area because honestly, infectious diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's, they've been around for as long as humans, but food allergy seems to be a new problem. And that's really excited the community's interest, which is why we tend to have a lot of media about it, but also because it has such a severe consequence if it goes wrong. I'm the chair of a school board, and I put up, presented to them, actually read out to them a coronial inquest recently. I find it really brings tears to my eyes when I read out the story of children who unfortunately have an adverse event that results in death. And once you've been exposed to something like that, you never go back to believing that food allergy is just made up and that kids, are really just being fussy. And that's now becoming very apparent in Australia. I think Australians are really paying attention to what can be, quite simply a life-threatening condition. But no one in the community can quite believe that a food as innocuous as peanut butter could actually kill a child or an adult, quite frankly. So this is my gallop through why I think food allergy is on the rise, and as I said, I'd be very happy to hear what your views are at the end of this. So allergies are increasing. This is some work from Ray Mullins, who's in private practice here in the ACT, from his own community-based specialist allergy practice, showing a rise in different allergic diseases. And he published another paper which showed that particularly in the under 5-year-old, food allergy anaphylaxis appears to be increasing. And this is the sort of slide that we tend to put up to show there's a problem going on, and we think it's increasing because anaphylaxis is the most easily characterised assessment of food allergy. And if you look at the changes that have occurred, it seems to have occurred somewhere in between the mid-1990s and the mid-2000s, and particularly in this under 5-year-old age group. And that's what people are most interested in, is something happening in those early determinants of health and disease, that first 1,000 days that the DOHAD model is so interested in looking at. And so there are some people who say, well, it's just an increase in reporting. It may well be that there's the same amount of food allergy and there's just more severe reactions going on. And yes, that could be the case, although we've got some more recent research that just last week we published to argue that that is not the case. But certainly 30, 40 years ago, it was close to zero. I mean, just anecdotally, there wasn't a lot of it around. Might have been underdiagnosed, but no one really quite believes that, particularly clinicians, because when people walk into your room, it's a pretty clear definition. You know, the mother comes in and says, my child's just had a bite of their first peanut butter sandwich, their lips swelled up, they had hives all over their body, they started to cough and wheeze. We think they're allergic to the peanut butter, doctor. What do you think? And it's pretty clear when you hear those sorts of definitions or those sorts of descriptions when they present clinically. The difficulty is for the other types of food allergy, which I could give several hours lectures about, which is the GI types of food allergy, which is how I first got involved in this area, which are the gut reactions. And they're much more nefarious, more difficult to diagnose and to manage. And there's lots and lots of different syndromes associated with those. But this particular condition, IgE-mediated food allergy, it's a clear history. You then have to have an antibody detected by either serum or by skin prick test, and it's very easy to diagnose and then also very easy to manage. So I'm not going to talk about management much today, but just to sort of mention that doctors really need now to understand food allergy and anaphylaxis because it is so common. I'm the director of a centre called the Centre for Food and Allergy Research, which is an NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence, which is just finishing its first 5 years, and we're hoping to be funded for another 5 years. But it aims to increase the understanding on the causes of food allergy, but also we want to try and prevent people from having adverse events and also find a cure. So we've done pretty well, we think, in the first 5 years, and I'll present some of the data that's come out of this centre. So we really feel like we've moved from describing an epidemic, because of course that's what we do as scientists, we observe problems, to actually trying to predict why this has happened, and then we want to actually move to prescribing solutions. So moving not just from observation, but understanding why it is on the rise, and then what can we actually do about it. So I always sort of put it into this sort of general description of we had the clinical problem first, we then went out to the general population and observed, is this a population effect or is it just people turning up to our practices more? We then have been identifying mechanisms, modifiable factors and biomarkers, and we're really now right at this leading edge now, and it's terribly exciting for food allergy research, not just here in Australia but around the world, looking at prevention, treatment trials and optimising management pathways. And I say this without embarrassment, that Australia is really leading the way, not just with medical and clinical management of food allergy, but with the research into prevention, management and cure. People are looking to Australia for leadership in this area, and Australia is really answering that call to finding the solution because our problem seems to be so much worse here. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the Health Nut study, which is a study that's been running now for 10 years exactly, the Health Nut study. It's a population-based cohort study in Melbourne of 5,300 infants followed from age 1, and we're about to start the age 10 follow-up now. The participation in this study was quite remarkable, and people say, how did you get so many people from the population wishing to participate? And the answer is the allergy waiting lists were exploded. Families really wanted to get their kids allergy tested before they introduced peanut butter, so we hooked into what they needed, and we provided free allergy testing by being part of the study. And whenever the media interview these people, we don't even need to prep them. They give these fantastic media interviews when they say, thank goodness that Dr. Allen came along and did this test, because then we didn't have anaphylaxis in the general community. And they're obviously shocked when they're diagnosed, but they're also relieved that it's being diagnosed under medical supervision. So it's a population sample across Melbourne Metropolitan. The sampling frame has been constructed very, very carefully. We looked at 29 of the 31 local government areas. We know that it is population representative. We have whole papers regarding the sampling frame, and people had to be attending an immunisation clinic. So they were attending for a different reason, not for an allergy reason. And then we also sampled those who didn't wish to participate and did back weighting of the prevalence. So we do know that it's a very good population representative sample. It's probably the best population-based study. That's not my fault. It's the other epidemiologists on the study who are very good at designing a first-class study. And then we went out to all these different places randomly. People didn't know where we were turning up to, and they didn't approach us, we approached them. So it was truly a very good population sampling frame. We did skin prick testing of all 5,300 children at age 1, and we also did this non-participant questionnaire. And then any child who had a positive skin prick test was brought into the hospital and given the food, irrespective of where they reacted before, irrespective of where they thought they had an allergy. And the nurses and doctors supervising the clinic were blinded to skin prick test and previous history of reaction. So it's a very, very highly qualified study to say we know whether they've got food allergy or not. And we also had 200 negative controls. And we've been then following the kids up every couple of years. And that's been published a couple of years ago as a cohort study, if anyone would like to look up the methodology behind that. But what was astounding about this study was we thought we might have 1% or even 5% having challenge-proven food allergy, and we were staggered to find it was 10%. So 1 in 10 infants at age 12 months reacted. And even if you don't believe that data, the fact that 1 in 20 or 5%, 1 in 5 or 20% of children had school nuts, looking at this very question, we 5 years ago could see this epidemic coming through our clinics. So we got out in front of the epidemic and started looking at these kids in the school environment to see what are the factors for why they might be having adverse events. And I haven't got much time to go into this study in particular, but you'll see a lot of these papers coming out this year. So it's a study to watch, very good quality study as well, looking at children with food allergy and anaphylaxis in the general community in this risk period, and what their environment is like and what their knowledge and attitudes are, and what the non-allergic children's knowledge and attitudes are as well, because the children are in an environment that we need to measure. And that study is just a little bit of early data from that particular study from last week. It was published, showing that any food allergy was somewhere between 4.5% and 5.5%. So that's where we come up with the figure of 1 in 20 or 5% of adolescent children have food allergy, and that's being driven both by peanut and tree nut allergy, which are between 2 and 3%. And just a one comment about nut-free schools, which is a bit of a passion of mine. Look, children have to eat food, but they have to eat the food to get anaphylaxis as well. We don't support nut bans in schools. There's a lot of families who do wish to nut ban, but we recommend no food sharing. And the reason for that is that you can't ban all of the foods that have caused an anaphylaxis in a school environment. It's impossible to do because there are so many foods that cause anaphylaxis. And in fact, I got a call from a journalist in Canberra about 5 or 6 years ago, it must be longer, 10 years ago, when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, saying the journalists had been told they weren't allowed to eat bananas before coming onto a school here in Canberra, and they were worried about banana anaphylaxis in the school. And my comment was, well, the journalist would have to kiss the child for the child to get anaphylaxis, and that would be the story, not the fact that there was anaphylaxis in the child with banana allergy. Anyway, so we think that food sharing is actually, or banning food sharing is a much simpler way to keep the children safe, because it's something that should be across the schools anyway. Although my children tell me they love food swapping. It's a slightly different thing, but don't swap foods with a child with allergies. And the reason for that is then the child just has to be clear about the food they've been provided by someone that they trust, an adult, that they trust, their parent, or if that's been delegated to someone else, then they can be sure of the source of that food. And we do need to emphasise action plans and training and recognition of treatment of anaphylaxis in schools. And again, Australia has been leading the way, with Victoria having the world's first legislation about anaphylaxis training and safety in schools. And Australia does not take a back seat with regards to safety and in anaphylaxis in schools. So why is the prevalence of food allergies so high in Australia? It is the $64 million question. And there are many reasons why we think that's the case. This is just a little photo of the Royal Children's Hospital, by the way. If you ever want to come and visit our very beautiful hospital, we love to have host guests down there. But it seems that allergies have risen more quickly than genes can change. So from an epidemiological consideration, I suppose we feel it's something to do with the developed lifestyle. And we have a whole host of laboratory-based researchers down in Melbourne who are looking at epigenetic regulation of gene control and what might be changing with regards to control of these genes. But the simple answer is it's something to do with the modern lifestyle, and that's a pretty unsatisfactory answer, but it's a good one because it covers everything that we do, really. But we've sort of honing down on what we call 3 hypotheses that we think are important and we think are based on an evidence generation that we've come up with. But these are some of the sort of generic things that have been changing over those sort of period of decades that there's been a rise in the food allergy prevalence. And I won't go into the details of these, but this was something that we put out in 2006 or 7, so it's a very old slide now, of some of the areas that we were starting to think about. And this is the data that we've been generating, and I don't expect you to read all of these things, that there's now 50 papers from Health Nuts alone that are informing this body of evidence. So it's a very detailed body of evidence, and I refer you to Jen Copland's, one of our postdocs, PhD paper in the International Journal of Epidemiology if you want to read further the actual substance of the evidence base. But this is my simple 5D response to that very complicated slide, which is the current leading hypothesis of postnatal modifiable factors for the rise in food allergy. So excuse the simplicity of this, but I have tried to explain this to many hockey mums. So it's the 5 Ds. The first one is dogs and dirt. The second one is the vitamin D hypothesis. And the third one is the dry skin and diet hypothesis, which is actually termed the dual allergen exposure hypothesis, which is much more of a mouthful. So I'm going to speak to each of these three just briefly because I don't have time to go into the details. But we now have a randomised control prevention trials in all of these areas ongoing now. And I think that's where the excitement is we're not just observing, we're actually predicting, and now we're prescribing a solution. And we want to hear what the evidence base tells us when we try to prevent food allergy. Can we actually do it? Can we turn back this time? So the dry skin and diet is really a summary of eczema and infant feeding. So we know that children with eczema in the first few months of life are the ones at most risk of developing food allergy, and we know that delaying the introduction of certain allergenic solids does increase your risk of food allergy. So I'll provide a bit of evidence for that. This dual allergen exposure hypothesis was promulgated by Gideon Lack from London, and I like to call it the Lack hypothesis because it's less of a mouthful. He doesn't like to be told that, but because he's a very humble man. But the simplest way to describe it, he says, is that the immune system is being activated or alarmed by exposure through cutaneous exposure, and that's all described here, and more so by children who have broken down skin barrier function as occurs in eczema or early onset eczema, but also children with filaggrin gene deficits, and we've published on that, which is one of the genes that informs the skin barrier function. But that can be abrogated and the immune system trained if you actually have oral exposure through the gut. And so if you expose through the skin but don't give through the gut, then you get an increased risk of developing allergy. But if you actually give the food to the child at the critical window, then you can induce tolerance. So this is the evidence from our own study that early onset eczema is associated with food allergy. Just concentrate on the dark bars. If you've got a child who's having the use of doctor-prescribed steroids, so that just includes any doctor-prescribed steroids, and the eczema onset is in the first 3 months of life, you've got a 50% chance of developing challenge-proven food allergy at age 1. And you can see that the later your onset or the less severe your eczema, the less likely you are to have food allergy. And we also know that Australia is up high in the honour board with regards to prevalence of eczema. This is in older age groups, but we do have a lot of eczema in Australia. You just need to ask anyone who has kids. There's a lot of eczema around. So maybe it's the eczema that's been rising that could be one of the initial drivers of this food allergy epidemic. The second thing is the way that we feed infants, and this is the hottest thing at the moment because of the New England Journal paper from Gideon Lack, showing that delaying the introduction of solids, or peanut I should say, increases the risk of peanut allergy. Now that's one study, it's a randomised control trial, and I'll show you the results in a moment. But I have some suspicion about it because I can't believe that change in infant feeding could cause this epidemic, but there is a definite hypothesis for that. If you look at when we've been introducing solids, well, people have been introducing solids between the age of 4 and 6 months, so we haven't really delayed the introduction of solids, even though WHO would like us to introduce solids after the age of 6 months. And in fact, it's based on this data that I've been trying to convince WHO, I've been in Geneva 3 or 4 times now, that can't we use the word around 6 months because no one's listening to their recommendation of exclusive breastfeeding to the age of 6 months. And then egg introduction is happening at a reasonable time, but it's happening earlier than peanut introduction. We're finding that in our cohort anyway, children were being introduced to peanut quite late. But egg allergy is actually the commonest cause of food allergy, and so the delay in the introduction of solids, in my view, can't explain the ecological reasons for why there's been a rise in food allergy. It may explain the peak, but it doesn't explain the actual cause of it. So Gideon Lack has been arguing this case for now 10 years, and good on him. I think it's an incredible outcome that he actually went ahead and raised a huge amount of money to get this study done that was published in the New England Journal in February 2015. What he did was take children with eczema or egg allergy and then randomise them to receiving peanut or not peanut early in life from the age of about 4 to 6 months for the first 5 years. Now, this study is the most expensive study I've ever heard for just feeding infants. He estimates it was between 20 and 30 million euro. to do this study. It's incredible, 620 infants. It's a very well done study, and they really harassed families to take the peanut in the form of bomba. And it was a stunning set of results. So they had a really high rate of reduction in those who consumed peanut versus those who avoided it, right across the different cohort sizes, subgroups. So it is a stunningly successful study, but it was really to say don't delay the introduction of peanut, which seems a pretty simple thing to say. And when you speak to grandparents, they say, well, we didn't tell anyone to delay the introduction of peanuts in the first place, and we didn't have peanut allergy. But this study is what's completely driving the change to infant feeding guidelines. And I absolutely support and believe this evidence. It just took a lot of money to get to that point. So our new updated infant feeding guidelines say when your infant is ready at around 6 months, but not before 4 months, start to introduce a variety of solid foods. And then this is the key point. We've separated out this point as a second point. All infants should be given allergenic solids, including peanut butter, cooked egg and dairy, and wheat products in the first year of life. So we're not arguing it's 4 months or 6 months or 10 months. It's in the first year of life after you've started solids. So solids are around 6 months, but not before 4, which is kind of the same as 4 to 6 months, but don't tell WHO. And then allergenic solids in the first year of life once you've started solids. So the second hypothesis, which is my particular favourite, is the vitamin D hypothesis. And certainly the community loves this hypothesis because it's all about sunshine and good quality food. But when I talk about vitamin D potentially contributing to the epidemic in Australia, everyone in the US and in Europe say, but don't you have a lot of sunshine down there? So you shouldn't have any problems. But I think we've been being caught a bit shortchanged with vitamin D in Australia. And I know there are some people who think everyone should be on vitamin D and it's dangerous if you don't. And then there are other people who think it's effectively lolly water and it doesn't have any effect. So it's a very equivocal hypothesis at the moment. But there's no doubt that Australia is one of the last countries to either fortify its food chain supply or provide infant supplementation with vitamin D. And we have a fabulous slip, slop, slap campaign. So we do know there's high levels of vitamin D deficiency, and this could be one of the factors that may be driving immune deviation in infants in the first year of life. So as I mentioned before, we did another study, we explored a study that's already running called the Longitudinal Study of Australian Children, which is actually run out of Canberra from the National Cohort of National Centre of Longitudinal Studies, I think. And we analysed the data from this cohort of children and found the further from the equator you live, the higher your rates of peanut allergy. And that data is replicated by a number of other studies, including in the US and in Chile, which has a nice long latitudinal gradient, that the further from the equator you are, whether it's in the south or in the north, the more likely you are to have various forms of various descriptions of food allergy. So this was an interesting finding that prompted us to look more specifically in health nuts to see if we could see any direct evidence that vitamin D played a role. And we were surprised to see that in non-Asian children, so in Australian children, that in fact if you had peanut allergy, you were 11 times more likely to be vitamin D deficient. If you had egg allergy, you're 4 times more likely to be vitamin D deficient. And there seemed to be a bit of a trend effect whether you had no food allergy, a single food allergy, or multiple food allergies. So suspicious that vitamin D is important, not obviously strong evidence, but suspicious evidence. So we've now gone on to mount a study called the Vitality Trial, which is looking at baby vitamin D drops in the first year of life. It's a randomised control trial of vitamin D versus placebo, daily drops of 400 international units every day for the first year of life. We've already recruited the first 350 babies, and we aim to recruit 2,000 babies. And some preliminary evidence suggests that it is actually effective, but we have to wait and see what happens when we finish the study. So I'm agnostic about the outcomes because I think one way or the other we need to actually work out is vitamin D important in the first year of life. And nobody has done a postnatal trial of babies with vitamin D anywhere in the world for any outcome. So if this is a null effect, we'll still go on to look at other things like bone health. But if it's a positive effect, if vitamin D is a preventive factor, it's so easy to roll out at the population level just to have daily drops for babies in the first year of life. So the last hypothesis is the dogs and dribble, or the hygiene hypothesis. And that's, it's a bit of a misnomer. David Strachan first described the word, or coined the term, the hygiene hypothesis in 1989 with a study in The Lancet, which showed that if you had more children in the house, that you were protected from allergic rhinitis. So at that time it was thought to be due to overcrowding, and that's where the dribble aspect comes from, is sharing microbes with other siblings. But we also found, when we looked in Health Nuts, quite surprisingly, that his hypothesis did stand true for food allergy in our cohort as well. So we found that contact with pets and siblings appears to be protective, and there's the data there to show you, using an adjusted odds ratio with a per sibling effect of 0.72, and dogs allowed inside the house as also being protective. So what aspect of sharing an environment with dogs and children, we don't know. We've tried to adjust for things that we think might be important, but you probably don't want to think too closely about that. And you can't really recommend that as a public health initiative. So getting back to this, well, allergies have risen more quickly than genes. Is there anything else that we can look at sort of either an ecological level or an epidemiological level before we go deep into mechanisms? And there's a whole another set of talks that we could look at, the immune mechanisms behind what we think is going on. And I suppose what we thought was to look at a more natural history experiment, to look at the story of migration, and to look at this concept of the developed country aspect. And so we do know in the Health Nuts cohort, and we do also see this in School Nuts, and I also see this in my clinic, that Asian children seem to have more food allergy. And we know that is the case. It's been held up throughout Australia and all of our different studies. So the question is, why is that, and is there something we can learn from that? So we looked carefully in Health Nuts and found that if you look at the blue bars, that's anyone with any challenge-proven food allergy, that if you had both parents who were Australian-born versus one European versus both European, you were less likely to have food allergy than if one parent was born in Asia or both parents were born in Asia. And that held true for all of the different food allergies. So you can see egg allergy, the same rises there. Green is the peanut allergy. So there's no doubt that children who have parents born in Asia seem to have the highest rates of food allergy. So the infants of parents born overseas are much more likely to have food allergy, but interestingly, the parents themselves had very little allergy themselves. So the question is it a gene effect or an environmental effect? So the question we asked ourselves is, what about if a child from Asian parents was actually born in Asia and moved to Australia? Were they protected? And interestingly, we found that indeed they were. So, I seem to have missed that slide. What a bummer. So I must have got rid of it myself, sorry. So we actually looked in the school entry health questionnaire study, which is a survey that goes out to 65,000 children at age 5 at school entry, or to their parents. And all 65,000 families receive a questionnaire about whether their child has nut allergy. And, it's a fairly imprecise way of defining it, but because it's such a large cohort, you can actually look at it in fairly precise terms. And we found that children who were born to Asian parents of Asian descent did indeed have higher rates of peanut allergy if they were born in Australia. But the children who were born of Asian parents who were born in Asia and moved to Australia in the first 4 years of life had virtually none. In fact, we had no cases of peanut allergy or nut allergy. So it seemed that it was protective to be born in Asia if you were Asian of Asian extraction. So that makes us raise the question, could the removal of the protective Asian environment increase the expression of being genetically at risk for food allergy? So that suggests that really the first 1,000 days really are very critical for the immune system in infants, and it does give us hope that there's something that we can do about it. So what factors, so that leaves us with what factors might prevent food allergy. Where are we at with regards to recommendations that we can make? We recommend that solids are introduced around 6 months and not before 4 months. That peanut, eggs, dairy are introduced in the first year of life after solids have commenced. Owning a dog and more siblings appears protective. And maintaining vitamin D in the normal range may be critical in the first year, but we still have to wait for the trials to be finished. And the other area is prevention of eczema. There are actually trials ongoing from our group as well, looking at moisturising with ceramide, which is an important emollient from baby skin, in the first few days to weeks of life. So there's a lot of work going on trying to prove these factors. But then what about curing food allergy? It's all very well to talk about preventing it and improving management. Are there cures on the horizon for food allergy? And I'm pleased to say there are. There's a lot of studies in progress as we speak, looking particularly at peanut allergy. A lot of money's been raised around the world. And Mimi Tang, who works at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, has come up with a very exciting proposed therapeutic called P-Poet. And that's been quite generally in the press in Australia. It's a combination of probiotics and peanuts as a form of oral immunotherapy. So it's taking the two ideas of good bugs, so the hygiene hypothesis, and allergen exposure to try to induce tolerance. And her work is extremely exciting, and it's again part of the Centre of Research Excellence has been to help get that study off the ground as a multi-centre trial, and the multi-centre trial is in progress. But this is the preliminary data from her pilot study called P-Poet, Probiotic and Peanut Oral Immunotherapy Randomised Control Trial. So she took 62 children who'd had an objective reaction in the last 2 years and a positive skin prick test, and then randomised them either to probiotic plus peanut oral immunotherapy or a placebo arm. She then followed them for 18 months and then re-challenged them, and with a double-blind placebo-controlled peanut challenge. She also took a whole lot of different samples, which she and the team are busily analysing now to see what mechanisms might be important in the induction of tolerance in the kids who did respond. And Mimi's group and my group work very closely together, and we share a lot of samples, so we're looking across all of our studies with regards to mechanisms of disease. And this is her clinical outcomes from her study, which was published in JACI, which is the top allergy journal, showing quite stunning reduction in the sustained unresponsiveness, which is the definition that you can actually eat peanuts freely. 82% could eat peanuts freely after being on P-Poet versus only 3.6% in those who had placebo. And she had good rates of desensitisation as well. So very, very encouraging and exciting results. This has now been spun out into a startup company, and I think the likelihood of this getting to commercialisation is pretty high if the subsequent multi-centre study replicates these findings. And the very exciting aspect about a therapeutic like this is that it's simply peanuts and probiotics, so it doesn't need to go through too much regulation and control in order to get to patients. So do warn people that you can't do this at home, because giving peanuts at home can cause anaphylaxis, and these kids do have quite a lot of anaphylaxis in their updosing aspect of their oral immunotherapy. And the probiotics that are used are very high dose, therapeutic grade probiotics, so you can't just eat a bit of Yakult off the shelf. So just to sort of finish with the Centre of Food and Allergy Research, our vision has been to better understand how to prevent, manage and cure food allergy. We've been working with anaphylaxis guidelines and school policies. We've also been working with manufacturers about food labelling, and that again is a whole other story, but very interesting area about may contain traces, which seems to drive patients to despair because they can't interpret them. But we also have a lot of work going on now about the genetics, epigenetics and immunology of food allergy, and those papers are now emerging and are very exciting to try and understand what on earth is happening to these poor children's immune system and how it's being regulated at the genetic level. And I suppose this is our aim, is to really try and have an impact on eradicating food allergy as a public health threat. So we put this in for our defence of our CRE. It's a very ambitious approach, which is in the first CRE, or Centre for Food and Allergy Research, was to actually start to decrease some of this prevalence, including the prevalence of current adverse events, but also the prevalence of new cases through management, prevention and cure. And it'd be lovely to come back in 5 years' time and say we've managed to achieve it. But we're also measuring what we do to make sure that we're not just guessing it, we're evaluating it, and we do see a decrease in the prevalence of food allergy, and there seems to be some evidence for that as we speak. So I'd just like to finally thank a massive team of co-investigators. This work has really taken place because of a willingness of people to collaborate across a wide variety of disciplines, including people like Melissa Wake and Charlene Damagay, who are amazing epidemiologists, Mimi Tang, who's an extraordinary immunologist, Lyle Gurran, statistician, Melanie Matheson, a population geneticist, Terry Dwyer, who is the Institute Director, and Colin Robinson, who's a lung health expert. But this big team of particularly PhD students, there's been, I think, 7 or 8, I've lost count now, PhD thesis off the back of Health Nuts itself. So it's been very powerful in really training up the next generation of researchers, hopefully who can get the job completed in a timely manner so that we have less children at risk of developing food allergy, and more importantly, less children dying from it, because every case that occurs is a case too many. I've been reviewing a coroner's case just recently, and I do find it very confronting to read when people don't take seriously an event that's unwinding in front of their very eyes. It's awful experience to see someone die from anaphylaxis from food allergy, and it affects not just the family, but the carers, the doctors and the nurses, but the whole community. It's a dreadful, dreadful thing that should never happen. And I'd just like to thank my amazing team. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thanks, Katie, for a wonderful presentation. I'm sure there'll be some questions, and if anyone does have any questions, just pop your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you so that we can record this. Just while we're getting to the first one, if I could ask you one. So, amongst the possible predisposing factors, you had one allergen-specific factor and the others were non-allergen specific. They were presumably thought to modify overall the immune response. So I'm wondering if you have much information about the changing prevalence of anaphylaxis to other allergens other than foods.
So the prevalence for all the allergens has increased all in concert. So when we talk about IgE-mediated food allergy, we talk about the big 8, which account for 90% of all food allergies. So the big 8 are peanut and tree nut, cow's milk and egg and soy, wheat, fish and shellfish. And they account for more than 90% of food allergies. If you go to a different region, a different place in the world, there are some unusual food allergies that cause anaphylaxis. So for instance, bird's nest soup is a cause of anaphylaxis in Singapore. But it seems that when the rise in anaphylaxis occurs, it occurs fairly uniformly across all of the different causes of anaphylaxis, with peanut and tree nut being the most common, and then cow's milk in children being the second most common. So it seems to be uniform.
But for non-foods?
So for drugs and for insect stings and things like that, yeah, they haven't risen to the same degree as food allergy.
Thank you.
I have to say, drug anaphylaxis is Richard Lowe's leading the National Allergy Strategy, and drug anaphylaxis is the hidden iceberg. I mean, it is a bigger cause of death from anaphylaxis by far and away, and it occurs most commonly in hospitals. So that actually is something that Richard's very passionate about trying to bring to the fore, that there's a lot of drug anaphylaxis and death from drug anaphylaxis going on that's not being measured at all. So it's very hard to get good solid data on it. But we have been looking at anaphylaxis registries, and it does seem to be that food allergy is rising over and above the rate of drug anaphylaxis.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. Thank you, Professor Allen. I've heard you speak a number of times, and it's always really fantastic. I'm really interested in the gut microbiome story because part of my research is looking at infant gut microbiome. And I'm just wondering, the probiotic that's in use, is it a multi-strain? I know you can't give too much away. I'm just wondering if it's a multi-strain.
Oh, no, I can give it away. It's in the paper. So the one that Mimi's used is Lactobacillus GG. But I have to say probiotic therapy, and I've reviewed the area, it's a bit disappointing with regards to the prevention of allergic disease in general. With regards to treatment, there's not a lot of treatment trials out there for probiotics, but for prevention anyway, there's quite a few, and there's for every sort of 3 or 4 papers that show it protects, there's another one that shows it increases it, so it's a bit problematic. And Mimi herself did an LGG antenatal probiotic for the prevention of eczema, and she didn't find that antenatal probiotics did prevent eczema, but she did find that the LGG had an impact on the baby's bifidobacteria species. So there seems to be a disconnect between the mother's organisms and the baby's organisms, which don't really quite make sense to people. But the Bowen infant study is sitting on a very interesting paper, and I think it's been released at a conference, so I can sort of mention that there is one species that Peter Villeman has identified that's highly protective, and he's busy trying to commercialise that as we speak for the protection of food allergies. So it is regarded as a sort of a bit of a holy grail. If we can get the bugs right, then everything will be fine. I get a lot from the general community about, well, it's to do with too much processed foods or too many preservatives. In fact, I'd say that's the number one reason the community think food allergies on the rise. And my background as a gastroenterologist is really hepatology, and I know that our P450, cytochrome P450 system is really effective at detoxifying things, so I find it hard to believe that the preservatives are the problem. But if it were preservatives, my sort of gut instinct, shall I say, is the fact that our food doesn't have any organisms on it anymore. It's very sanitised, whether it's preservatives or because it's been gassed. It's often gassed, and it's in plastic. And again, this is just anecdotal, but you can put food on your bench and it doesn't go off. It sits there for years, honestly. While when I was a child, food seemed to spoil more quickly. Now, again, that's just anecdotal evidence, so apologies, I can't help myself. But I wonder whether the food that we're eating, when we talk about a variety of food, we're talking about a variety of food that feeds the microbiome, including the food having a microbiome itself. We know breast milk has its own microbiome. So there's so much confusion about which one it is. Yep. And when you look at that picture that I had up there with the microbe man, which is on the front page of The Economist, I always think, if you've got gastroenterology on the front page of The Economist, we really made it, woohoo. But the microbe man is sort of, and you've all heard this before, so I don't want to repeat myself too much, but there are 10 times more bugs in our gut than there are cells in our body, or the other way of putting it is there's 10 times more species or bugs in our gut than there are people on this planet. So the diversity is so huge, and there are all these papers coming out saying this is the one bug, this is the holy grail, and then someone else does a study and it's not. So I don't really know the answer, but I suspect there's huge amounts of redundancy in the system. So you could probably have a set of bugs that are the right bugs, and then if you're missing this one, you don't have that outcome. But what we really need to move to, and that's what we've struggled with, is the functional consequences of the microbiome. So the impact of short-chain fatty acids on the gut mucosa, or propionate or butyrate or acetate.
I think that's got a long way to play out. I'm looking at human milk oligosaccharides for their prebiotic effect, and that it's just this enormous amount of burgeoning knowledge out there. So I think it's got a long way to play out.
It has, and it also, we've got to be so careful with the with how precise we are with it, because no one can agree about how to measure a microbiome of the gut. It's sort of like looking from outer space and saying everyone with dark hair are robbers. And you go, well, is that right? Maybe there's a few robbers with dark hair, but there's a few blondies who are actually robbers as well. So that's the tricky thing, is that we're looking at it at such a macro level, and I think we're a long way from trying to work out what to do. But I mean, we're at the other end of the spectrum in gastro, where we're doing fecal microbial transplants, and I've done 3 in Melbourne, and gee, they work, they're very effective, but who knows why. I mean, we're just replacing one gut microbiome wholesale with another, and it does work. But there's a lot more we need to understand, including the things that are being discarded by the body, maybe not the things that are actually stimulating the gut mucosa. We're measuring the refuse, not the actual gut microbiome that's adhering to the gut mucosa. So there's so much more we don't understand. But a very exciting area, if you wanted to explore a new research area, gut microbiome is very hot at the moment.
Thank you.
I have to actually add one little thing, is that the Mediterranean diet, and I know you're deep into nutrition, but the Mediterranean diet has always been argued as being the healthiest diet, and the argument is the olive oil or the nuts or the fresh fruit and vegetables, but no one mentions the vinegar. And we do know that, salad dressings always have olive oil and balsamic vinegar. And balsamic vinegar is a very rich source of acetic acid. And the gut, the colon, the colonocytes, they only get fed by propionate and acetic acid. So I don't know, to me, we sort of might be missing something. It may be the acetic acid that's important in the Mediterranean diet. Plus, once wine gets converted to vinegar, it's actually essentially acetic acid, so maybe that's why healthy diet with a bit of wine is helpful, I don't know. Not that I drink, by the way.
Thanks, Katie. I have to declare myself as a one-time hockey mum before I ask this question. I am interested, and maybe I've missed something, but this 4-month threshold. I'm wondering about this 4-month threshold and why it's there, because I fed my children at 3 months solids, and also this link with Asian children born overseas. From what I've experienced in my life, Asian children born overseas are fed earlier as well, so they get to chomp on the bones of their parents' food, etc. And I'm wondering, why 4 months?
Right, anyone from WHO here? So this is a really interesting area, and we just have to be very careful because it's a political nightmare. So we've got on one side WHO that's caring for the developing world, and we know that kids who get fed formula with contaminated water die. There's no doubt about that. So the WHO is holding back, the sort of commercial oversight of trying to get babies onto formula, and good on them. And we do know that babies die of diarrhoea in the first 6 months of life, so that's the first thing I need to say. But I've been trying to convince WHO that we're getting a two-speed economy going, even in places like India and Africa. India has 350 million middle-class people who are desperately trying to get formula, and same with China. They're importing formula from New Zealand and Australia because, they think it's going to make their babies more intelligent. If you've ever been into China, all the signs, especially as you go over the borders, are, get your special designer formula from Canada. It's the best, it's like the Hermes of Canadian milk, And so there's a big commercial push, and there's a big appetite for it in developing countries. So we've got WHO on one side. Then we've got Gideon Lack on the other side saying earlier the better, to the point where I've been asked to be involved in a study that looks at introduction of allergen exposure from 1 or 2 months of age. Now, the history of infant feeding is quite convoluted. So about 100 years ago, there weren't any formulas around, and it was very complicated. If you couldn't breastfeed, babies effectively died. And then formulas started to be produced, and they caused a lot of spitting up because they were pretty primitive. They weren't being processed enough to be gentle on the stomach. And then in 1974, the UK Committee of Toxicology decided that it was going to recommend that solids were not introduced before the age of 4 months. And that was because of some epidemiological studies from my own discipline, from gastroenterology, showing that celiac disease appeared to be on the rise. Now, I'm not actually a qualified epidemiologist, though I hang around with a lot of epidemiologists, but if you look at those studies, they're very poorly done because epidemiology was just emerging, and there were population studies of 12 cases, and we had whole recommendations being changed on these very primitive studies. And I hate to point this out, but gastroenterologists then had finally developed endoscopes, flexible endoscopes, so they could diagnose celiac disease. Before that, it was Crosby capsules. So I went back and looked at what was the type of feeding that was happening before 1974, and the average age of introduction of solids, to your point, was 2 months of age. Now, this isn't infants sitting down and eating roast turkey meals, by the way. This was the addition of cereals to formula or little bits of food to babies. And in fact, if you go to Africa, they give little bits of food to their baby from quite early on. So Gideon's argument is, earlier the better. WHO's O's is after 6 months. And Gideon has this one RCT of peanut, but the peanut started from 6 months onwards. And so I've said to people, look, it might be true that earlier is better, but please, let's not change the guidelines until we have the evidence. So let's stick with WHO. Let's try to get WHO to agree that's around 6 months and not before 4, which is where we think the critical window is. Let's introduce allergens soon after that, because the only evidence is the peanut trial. One trial, a lot of money, but one trial, which was peanut exposure in the first year. And then if we have to come earlier, we're future-proofing ourselves that we're not flip-flopping all the time, because even our patients tell us that they can't keep up with where we're sitting on it. And I never forget when we published our egg paper, because we found egg introduction between the ages of 4 and 6 months was protective. And I was sitting in my clinic with the door open, and there was this little boy outside saying, "Mum, do you know if you introduce egg, you don't get egg allergy?" And I thought, gee, that really got in through the media and into the person's head, you know, even before they came into my room. And they came in and told me all about it. It was quite nice because I was sitting there saying, well, that was our work. So it was quite, they thought we were pretty good then. So it could be that earlier is better. We have one paper that we're just about to publish, which has looked at cow's milk exposure. And because Gideon and I are always disagreeing, I always say to Gideon, I'm your best supporter, because I'm always trying to take the other side of the argument to sort of have good scientific evidence, and I keep proving him right, which drives me nuts. So he always stands up and says, so Katie, you've got egg on your face yet again. And so I've been saying, surely it can't be the time of exposure. And we've got this paper that shows a very high protective effect of cow's milk in the first 1 or 2 months of life for protection against cow's milk allergy. So I'm going to have milk on my face this time, you know, yet again. So I've been engaged to maybe start this trial in the US about exposure of allergens in the form of a formula, only 3 times a week while still breastfeeding, because we don't want to upset breastfeeding, because breast is best, and trying to stimulate the immune system early. So I think you might be right, but let's wait for the evidence is my simple answer. Getting a bit long-winded with my answers. Maybe I should come up with one sentence.
Thank you. The difference in the Asian environment, children born in an Asian environment, is amazing. So my question is, how many of those were there? Were there enough to be statistically significant? And if they were statistically significant, what research is going on now to find out what the difference is?
Excellent question, thank you. So it was statistically significant. You can look up the paper. It's published Panjari. Mary Panjari's first author in Clinical Experimental Allergy. Out of the 65,000, I think there were 500 kids who were born in Asia. I mean, you know, they're not massive numbers, but they're good enough. The thing about nut allergy is that we know it's it got reasonable veracity, because there's not any other causes of the reaction, unlike cow's milk allergy, where you can have lactose intolerance or non-IgE mediated forms of food allergy. Nut allergy, you don't have nut intolerance, it's just nut allergy. So that's why we chose that particular one. So the second part of your question was about what the factors are. So we've also published a paper about what we think the factors are, and it could be, I mean, they have different washing practices, less harsh detergents there. We have very, very high alkalinity of our detergents, which could be very dangerous for the baby's skin earlier in life. Their water pH is different. There's some evidence that water pH might be important for allergic disease, and it's possibly through its impact on the microbiome. I mean, clearly their vitamin D is going to be different because they're exposed to more sunlight up there. Obviously their microbes are very different as well. And that pretty much covers it, and they have a lot more dogs hanging around, and they live in a more rural environment often. So there's a lot of possible reasons for why it's protective. The Asian environment isn't protective. It could be giardia, it could be parasites as well. That's the old friends hypothesis. So what we're doing is we're now collaborating with Singapore with the Gusto trial. In fact, we've just sent some data off today to Gusto, trying to work out whether we can compare and contrast different cohorts. We also have a good, strong relationship with Hong Kong and China. We're doing the same thing. It would be interesting to do a reverse experiment of Westerners being born in Asia. It's harder because the numbers are smaller, and it's harder to get a population demographic because you really don't want asymmetry in the results. But I think what's interesting, and maybe this is why I'm not so keen on the allergen exposure, is that I know anecdotally that in Singapore they've got very high rates of eczema, but they've got very late introduction of solids. So they introduce all those solids at age 1, and they've got no food allergy. So there's sort of this disconnect when you look at the infant feeding around the world, and it's hard to say. So my argument is, Gideon's saying if you introduce peanut, you can prevent everything, and I'm like, well, that's not going to happen, is it? So we still need to keep pushing on it.
Paul.
Thanks very much, Professor Allen. You've been mostly talking about IgE mediated. Sorry, I'm over here.
Sorry.
I just wondered if you'd like to comment on the epidemiology of cell mediated and things like FPIs and things like that as to what's happening with that.
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, ironically, that's why I got into this area, because my rooms were full of these kids having gut reactions. And then I'd been working on hemochromatosis, which is a hepatological condition, and learnt some epidemiological skills. So I thought, well, I want to look at food allergy. I might as well start with the easy one, IgE mediated, and sort of 10 years later I'm still doing it. But I do keep trying to come back to my roots, which are the GI sort of food allergies. So unfortunately we don't have any answers at all about prevalence, because no one's actually said about looking at the prevalence, and it is something that we do need to do. I would say that FPIs we guess is as little as 1 in 20,000 or 1 in 30,000, based on trying to look at it in our big cohorts. Celiac disease, which we call a form of food allergy because it's an adverse event to food mediated by an immune system, but there are people who would argue that case, and that's probably around 1%. That's the commonest cause of GI food allergy. And then, so for people who don't know, FPIES is this very weird condition in the first year of life where children vomit profusely within 2 hours of first or second exposure to this allergen that causes them often to have shock and they become hypovolemic. Eosinophilic esophagitis, I think we think is probably around 1 in 15,000, and that does seem to be rising, and this is probably linked to allergic rhinitis and the rise in that. And then there's all these GI intolerances. If you put all the GI intolerances together, we did a survey about how many people think they've got a food allergy, and 1 in 3 households think they have some sort of food intolerance of some sort. So it's driving a lot of healthcare provision, it's driving a lot of shopping, as in food choices. And now if you go down a supermarket, there's a whole aisle for gluten-free foods. So there's a lot of perceived gluten hypersensitivity. The prevalence of gluten hypersensitivity from the NHANES data in the US looks like it's about the same prevalence of celiac disease. So for every case of celiac disease is a perceived case of gluten hypersensitivity, particularly in women between the ages of 20 and 50. No comments about that, please, about whether women are fussy eaters or whatever. It may be microbiome generated, we don't know. But yeah, there's more work to be done in that area. So again, a fruitful area for investigation. Thank you.
A question up the top there.
I just want to know if you looked into organic versus and pesticides, the influence of pesticides and as opposed to organic food.
Yeah, look, that's a it's very much front and centre of people in the community, and there is a lot of work being done. Anne-Louise Ponsonby is looking at, she's got a partnership grant with, she's one of my collaborators, a partnership grant with the Victorian government looking at this. So, and in fact, the Melbourne Atopic Cohort study is looking at this as well. So, pesticides, BPA, all of those things are things that are concerning people. As we speak, I don't know if we can really comment on organic because no one's done a study on that. I'd be very interested to look at the microbiome of organic foods versus not. Back to that point that I was talking about before, maybe there's more microfloral diversity in organic foods, but no one's done any work that I know of. But there is the difficulty with the area of BPAs and bisphenol A and all those sorts of complicated toxins is. If you look at them, they're everywhere now. Like you can't, very, very rarely can you find someone who hasn't been exposed for long periods of time. So all you can do now is dosing, and that's pretty inexact science as well. But when I went to a talk on it and someone actually put up slides to show that breastfeeding mums were giving more BPA to their kids than formula kids, I thought, oh God, we've got to give up now, really. There's no escaping these things. So yeah, they're concerning, but I'm not sure whether there's any evidence for them at the moment.
And we have one question down the front. We might make this the last.
I'll shout. I was wondering about not breastfeeding, the antenatal exposure, because my feeling as an old midwife is that women are not restricting their peanut intake, their allergen intake during pregnancy. So what's the story there?
So the question is antenatal exposure, so are the mums eating and exposing themselves to the allergen or not? And so 10 or 15 years ago, we told mothers to avoid peanuts and eggs and things during breastfeeding if they're at high risk, and we've now completely removed that that recommendation that mums can eat peanuts and eggs freely. It's partly because it's impossible to avoid it, firstly, but secondly, there is no evidence that allergen exposure in utero is bad for you. And I suppose what you're asking is, could it potentially be good for you? And the thing is, they're already on it anyway. So there is a study looking at increasing exposure to egg and peanut, and that does increase the amount coming through the breast milk. So there are people investigating that. Susan Prescott has a paper under review at the moment from UWA looking exactly at that question.
Well, I think, judged by the questions that your talk has stimulated, it's been something which has attracted a lot of interest here, and clearly the calibre of your work and your publications reflect the interest and esteem that it's held in internationally. So it's once again, I'd like to thank you for attending our meeting, for such an excellent talk. Got a small memento here for you, and I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Professor Allen for her talk.